I'm sure you know the situation when you press a 5H but you accidentally get a 2H in a range where normally a 5S would have hit in a 4S situation, and wait, you're not following what I'm saying? That's fine, because that's actually exactly the topic that I'm going to talk about today with notation in fighting games. If you're up to it, let's get to it. You wonder what a 5S is? Well, just look at this. No, not the keyboard. Man, that's dusty. No, I mean this. So regardless where you're coming from, all these notations have three structural foundations in common. The first of all is the state. Every notation defines a state in which your character has to be. Might it be crouching, might it be far, jumping, etc. The second part is the direction that you have to input. Is it neutral? Is it forward? Is it a motion? Regardless of how they are displayed, they show you what exactly you have to direct. And the third and last point that they all have in common is the button itself. Which button do you have to press at that moment? Now if we take an example with Jump 236K with Soul, that would be a air banded revolver. The J stands for jump, so with that we know that we have to be in a jump state in order to input this move. 236 of course stands for the quadricycle forward motion, so in that way we know what way we have to use our arcade stick with. And the K, well, the K just stands for kicking the snot out of the opponent's ass. So basically it's the kick button in Guilty Gear. Now that I've actually already mentioned that one example, maybe let's jump right into the first notation system that you can see quite commonly in the internet, the numpad notation. So before we jump into the explanation of why it's called the numpad notation, let's go through each structural thing in order first. So as we defined, every notation has a state defined. And in the numpad notation you basically always call them either J for jump, C for close, F for far, though that's sometimes seen as redundant, as well as SJ for super jump. The reason why it's called the numpad notation is because each stick direction is mimicked by the direction that you can see on your keyboard on the numpad. So a 6 would be forward, a 4 would be backward, 2 would be crouch, and 8 would be a neutral jump. And furthermore, you also have to keep in mind that in a notation there can be multiple numbers or digits in one move. So if for example you have 2, 3, 6, that doesn't mean that you're supposed to press all of these three directions simultaneously, but instead that you're supposed to press them in that order. So 2, 3, 6 would be down, down forward, forward, and then the corresponding button that comes after that. The only thing that you might also keep in mind is that each move is always separated with a comma. So if there's a new move that's supposed to start, usually we will separate that by comma, which makes it a little bit more readable, online at least. Now some of you might not be too familiar with this notation system, and that's because Street Fighter never really used it, and Tekken doesn't really use it either, which are arguably the two most popular fighting games right now. And also Smash has its own system, but actually this notation system is very commonly used in almost every other fighting game. In Soul Calibur, in Melty Blood, also in Dragon Ball it's very common. And it's so commonly used, it's been in almost every single game that has been in an Evo side game, except for Mario Kart. Who would have thought? Mario Kart. Now that we have the numpad notation out of the way, maybe let's move away from Mario Kart and let's jump into Tekken. That's a weird transition. Welcome to an alternate timeline when it comes to numpad. So, as you all know, Tekken notation does use numbers, but in a different way. And let me explain. States are still defined by letters. You know, the while standing, while crouching, full crouch, side steps, all that stuff. But now, here comes the change. For the directions we use letters. So a D would be down, a F would be forward, DF would be down forward, and etc, etc. And now comes the part where most people get tripped up by the notation system for Tekken, because the attack buttons themselves are notated by numbers. Now this is a little bit confusing for some, because everyone knows that in Tekken you have left punch, left kick and right kick. However, in combos we don't notate them as LP, RP, LK and RK, but instead we notate them as 1, 2, 3 and 4 in that order for left punch, left kick, right kick. And if you read up some Tekken combos online, you will also usually find that they will notate them with pluses. And the plus indicates if something is pressed together with a different button. So if you see a 3 plus 4, that would indicate that you have to press left kick and right kick together at the same time. Now Tekken also uses a symbol in order to close off a move from another move, but they don't use a comma in comparison to the numpad notation. In this case, they use a greater than icon in order to separate one move from the other. So to speak, they tell you to go from one move into the next move. It's actually quite similar in structure to most other notation systems. The only thing that really trips up people is that the vocabulary is kind of switched. But aside from that, there is little additional learning needed, except for some abbreviations that are kind of self-explanatory though. Now speaking of abbreviations, I think that's also one of the biggest advantages actually, as they make it very clear what you're talking about. Talking about while standing or side steps and stuff like that, you immediately get what you're supposed to do. That's a little bit more ambiguous with the numpad notation, and it's a big advantage over the Tekken notation in my opinion. Now there's one last notation that I want to talk about, and that is the Western Legacy notation. Now in comparison to the other systems that I've talked about so far, they don't use any numbers. Everything is done in characters. So first of all you have to state, and similarly to the numpad notation, it's defined by a letter. We have J for jump, we have F for far, CL for close, and etc, etc. There are still more, I won't name them all, but you get the idea. Now the directions though, they're defined by letters. So you have things like forward, that is abbreviated by F, but you also have motions like QCF, which is a abbreviation for quarter circle forward. So the Hadoken motion, so to speak. And also sometimes you have things that are more ambiguous. For example, the SPD is something that you will define as a 360, or also known as a spinning pile driver, which is basically the 360 motion for a command grab similar to Zangi, for example. And then we also have the buttons, and the buttons are basically just defined by LP, LK, MK, MP for light punch, medium punch, etc, etc. If you're from Europe, you will call a light punch and a hard punch a hard punch. But what the fuck is a strong? Now there are some advantages of course for this language as well. And for me the biggest language, and it's also why I am happy that I actually learned this one, is in the spoken language it's much more clear what you're referring to. Saying quarter circle forward light punch instead of a 236L is much easier to understand to a newcomer especially, and actually very important when you're doing commentary. So if you're thinking about jumping into the commentary game, keep that in mind. But with that out of the way, I think it's clear that every language, or let's call them dialects, have their advantages and disadvantages. There is no perfect language, and every single one of them has a drawback. Numpad notation is great for writing down combos and sending over to someone who doesn't speak your language, but it's really bad for commentary use and communicating verbally. The Tekken notation is great when you're playing Tekken itself, and if you want to have something that's really specific about Tekken, but it's a little bit more difficult when it comes to getting someone to understand it who maybe already has some sort of knowledge in other games. And applying it to other games is not really feasible. While the Western Legacy notation is a little bit easier to understand and quicker to grasp, and especially useful for commentary, it's a little bit too cluttery for using it as a written notation. and makes it, because of that, not really useful for Twitter and Wikipedias and stuff like that. The one thing I wanted to show with this video is that basically every notation system uses the same structure. It's not really difficult to learn the numpad notation if you've already figured out any of the other notations before. It's more of a vocabulary change than really a grammar change. So don't be too afraid to learn new notations. It doesn't matter if you come from numpad or from Western legacy notations. The more languages you speak, the easier it is for you to understand the other players as well. So really keep that in mind, and please be open to any of these languages. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the new format. This is my couch. I know this is the first time you probably seen it. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks again for my editor Accelerator for making this possible. Thanks also to Huggy for making the music that you can hear right now. Check out his Twitter, Spotify, etc, etc. He's doing amazing stuff and he really does a lot of great things. And thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and all that jazz, and see you next time.